there are basically two ways the world could be. Either a complete whole, and time exists within this complete whole, or reality exists as an incomplete state which truly proceeds into another incomplete state. This would be something like temporal B theory. You can also involve C theory in that, and we'll get into what the distinction there is. And then you have temporal A theory here. In the present moment, reality is simply this incomplete state. And after some transition to a new moment, the present really will be this incomplete state. That's under temporal A theory. But the question of the reality of that procession from one state to another state is then left unresolvable. Because if there is some kind of underlying syntax behind the procession of states, if there's some kind of order to state 1 of the universe moving into state 2 of the universe, then that transcends the reality of any particular moment in time. And the reality of the whole procession would be a whole. It's entirely possible within a whole to have the appearance of transformation between states. But if you want to posit that these states are absolutely incomplete and do really change one to another, you're describing some kind of dynamics, some kind of syntax underlying that transformation, and the background system of present moving into future itself, the whole timeline, will have to be given some kind of ontological status. And so is that real? If you're saying it's real, then reality as a whole, once again, embraces and contains this concept of duality, of past and future in this case. And if you say that this dynamics of an incomplete system moving to another incomplete system, moving to another incomplete system, if you want to say this underlying syntax of time, that which allows the transformation between states to take place, if that is not a fixed and ordered whole with a concrete syntactic identity, which we could describe as the fundamental laws or the truth of reality or logos or whatever, if there's no objectivity to the transition between incomplete states, then we can't know anything about reality, which follows because the transition in time from one state to another is not, ex hypothesi, governed by any stable set of laws. And so we can't infer anything about the future from the present or about the past from the present. So we can't deduce facts from given conclusions. We can't induce facts from observation. So the proposition that reality is fundamentally this incomplete mess, this chaos, that proposition undermines itself, because if it was that way, the claim that it is that way would not be grounded epistemologically. Moreover, it's self-contradictory in a more direct way, where the unboundedness of chaos here, this is the unboundedness of chaos, to posit it is to give it some kind of stable identity. Proclus would talk about this as every manifold participates in some way of unity. Because if we don't have that unity holding together a manifold into an identity that we can grasp with the term manifold, then the meaning of positing it as a manifold is gone. We don't mean anything by manifold if we're not talking about a manifold. And that fact that it is a manifold, a whole manifold, means it partakes of unity. And so in this debate between the two ways the world could be, one, it is a whole, and there is a truth about that whole that is all contained in this whole, and the other, an incomplete system that's subject to flux. This is logically the only defensible position. If you want to say it's this incomplete and chaotic procession, then positing that as the nature of reality is either positing that process as the underlying syntactical truth of reality, and in which case you're really positing a transcendental wholeness to this process and saying that that whole is reality, and that brings us back to this original hypothesis of unity as the foundation. Or you're saying there is no underlying syntax, the chaos is purely chaotic, in which case you're undermining your ability to claim that, and you are contradicting yourself in saying it, because in positing a chaos, you're giving a unity to the manifold just by articulating it. The only thing that you could say about a chaos is that maybe there's something like chaos that's not one thing that we can't pin down, we can't say anything about it, and it gives us literally zero information in any hypothesis because we can't even refer to it. You could refer to it by negation, and there's a role for apophatic predication in monistic metaphysics, but the kind of negation that you can ascribe to the chaos is, it's a black hole of meaning, right? Because with at least divine simplicity, saying that the whole doesn't fit into any of the particular concepts and categories that we get through perspective on the whole, that can point us to what the whole is outside of perspective. In the case of chaos, this notion of perspective within an ordered whole is eliminated, and by saying it's not what we see in perspective, it's a complete vacuum. The fact of its unity allows apophatic predication to have some kind of semantic value in the case of monistic metaphysics. In the case of eliminating the monad, eliminating order in the underlying world, no negation can have any semantic value because we're not guaranteed that the logical laws do in fact hold. There are other problems that come up with positing some kind of fundamental chaos or a fundamentally temporal nature to reality, like the nature of truth, right? If the future hasn't happened and you're a temporal atheist, we have a present moment here, T1, and there are different things that might happen, and we're not sure what's going to happen. T2A, T2B. So what is true if only one slice of time truly exists? Can we say anything about the future? If I claimed during T1 that B would be the case, was my claim true here and now? because this other moment in time had not actually happened and wasn't a reality. And so how could anything I say be true about this future state? Because it doesn't exist. I can't be right about something that doesn't exist, that is not real. The only way we could interpret some kind of truth value into the claim of the observer in T1 would be to posit that actually the state T2 does exist. Of course, there's another possibility where it's not that either T2b or T2a exists in the future, but actually both do. And the possibility of the transit is predicated by the access that observer in T1 has via its available energy, by the available laws of transformation, the access it may have to either of these two states. So it may be that from the perspective of T1, both T2b and T2a are possible. That is, they are real states observed by some real observer in each case, but as of the observer in T1's perspective, there's no difference between these two futures impinging upon this T1 state. T1, in other words, is unaffected by either the A or B route being selected. And a collapse of that possibility would occur as soon as any condition in the observer is inconsistent with one of these branches, in which case that branch is eliminated as a possible access for the observer in T1. So originally, when T1 claims that T2b will happen, the claim is that I will experience T2b, and that may turn out to be right or wrong. And with respect to this moment in isolation, it is both right and wrong from the perspective of these two observers. Observer in this universe would say the observer in T1 was right. Observer in this universe would say the observer in T1 was wrong. To avoid this possibility of being wrong in some universe, you would say that that A and B will happen for various observers. But that doesn't open up truth to some kind of absolute subjectivity. It makes it relative to a reference frame, but the possibilities of temporal precession will be guided by the available functions that an observer can carry out. Okay, so going back to that concept that reality is not incomplete, but complete, it is one whole already. There are basically two ways that completeness could be. One is simple, and the other is composed of parts. In the case of a simple reality viewed in its own right, taken as a whole, differentiation would be a product of particular perspectives being adopted. And no one perspective gives the true state of differentiation in the universe. The differentiated order is always relative to a particular perspective. You can't say anything about the relation of parts in the whole unless you first adopt a perspective on the whole. And that adoption of a perspective then is not adopting some I outside of reality to perceive the true nature of the parts that exist in reality independent of the observer. The creation of the observer is at the same time the creation of the dualities which that observer perceives. On the other hand, we could say that reality is actually fundamentally structured in some way where it does break down into different parts. Well, in the first place, reality could be simple and yet have some kind of fundamental ordering principle, right? Let's say this ordering principle here with this symbol, the chevron, this order is distributed globally, right? So there is an implicit order where no matter where you are, there is a kind of containing of all possible differentiated relationships and the way those unfold seminally in an order which is itself not differentiated by part in the whole of reality. It is globally distributed and would be the essence of reality. So no measure of distance within this kind of prime substance where, okay, so each node in the system contains implicitly all of the recipes for having relations to every other node, but those nodes containing all of the order of reality are the only real things. This is like Leibniz's concept of the monad. Every monad contains every other monad. Every form contains seminally every other form. But based on the assembly of points via any particular perspective, the relative strengths of the different formal elements, like the relative strengths of the different physical laws, for example, or any of these various possibilities for order, the relative strengths would be determined with the production of the perspective in the first place. And so it's not to say that in a simple universe there can't be order. It's only to say that the order emanates from some kind of transcendental order, transcendent order, which transcends any particular instantiation of order and is not broken apart into parts except with the production of perspective, which then implements the already implicit governing syntax baked into itself and baked into necessarily anything that it could interact with. If it's globally distributed, there is nothing that is outside of all syntactic laws being contained in it. And so the law that's created is, for any observer, it has to have relations which could be defined in terms of this implicit order, and any object that it perceives would also have to be defined in terms of this implicit order. On the other hand, you could say that the order of reality as a whole is broken up. So you have this whole thing, and in this part over here, things go this way. In this part over here, things go another way. Things go another way. There's another set of laws, different objects in different places that don't reduce to any one thing. That is, the structure is not like all these various points all lead back to, through a tree diagram, substantially this one. Instead, order is instantiated locally. Another problem, this basically replicates the problem of a system as reality which is incomplete, in that epistemologically, if there's no one all omni-distributed source of order, a universal logos, and instead nomological regularities are contextual ontologically, And so the distribution of things and their underlying laws is absolute in reality, then we can't make any claim at a meta level about how this state of affairs, where X law governs X place and Y law governs Y place, we can't make claims about that because there's no underlying syntax of the X and the Y where they are all brought back into some underlying universal framework, an omni-distributed nomology. So to say that reality is fundamentally in parts rubs up against our ability to describe the relation of those parts in terms of some kind of unifying principle. And so positing this kind of reality ends up being ad hoc because you're positing a multiplicity of entities, multiple parts, the existence of which you can't explain. And there's also another problem, which is the boundary problem. If reality is fundamentally in parts, which parts are on the outside and which parts are on the inside? And the part that's on the outside of reality, what is the nature of that fundamental ontological terminus? This is actually the most important implication between these two options. You're positing a more complex thing. Is it giving you more explanatory power? Maybe you could figure something out to give it explanatory power versus this, where all appearance of order is perspectival, although the order itself is everywhere and omniscient and omnipotent, but the particular partible relations emerge subsequent to that. So the parts of reality are emergent from an underlying unity and law. On the other hand, perhaps these parts could explain something, but the thing that needs still to be explained is why these parts run up to this particular place and then go no further. What is that terminal condition of reality? What is the constraint on reality as a whole? So in terms of the constraint condition, on the one hand, we could have a reality that is finite and a reality that is infinite. Now, a simple reality, once you take any given perspective, that could allow for an infinite horizon. Now, relative to any perspective where there's a difference of information, there will be a horizon of intelligibility where, from any perspective, in order for there to be differentiation, there has to be some kind of quantum of phenomenology for us, or of scale of relevance for whatever mechanism of observation exists for the observer. There will be a horizon beyond which there's no difference, in other words. Right? Information is a measure of the difference between states in a system. Well, any perspective relies on a kind of finitude. To be a perspective, P equals T and not T, there and not there. For something to be a perspective on something else, it has to have a part of it and also omit a part of it. And it's that omission that gives the finitude of perspective. So this would explain the appearance of a horizon, like the observable universe has a horizon, beyond which we can't get any information. It doesn't affect the observer. There's no means, no causal means of an interaction with anything outside of this envelope. Causal relevance. So a perspective necessarily generates a kind of limit, but beyond that, ontologically, if you assumed a perspective at that limit, you could then redraw an infinite horizon. And then the fact that you have a perspective draws a limit, and so on ad infinitum. That would be like an infinite cosmos in the simple conception, right? So all limits to the scope of reality, the variety of configurations, would be illusory, every limit. And in absolutely finite reality, you have the same fact of the underlying logic. So this, to be intelligible, relies on some kind of underlying law. We're using the chevron for that. So here too, you need an underlying law. These are similar in that respect. You need to explain the existence of perspective. This perspective explains the existence of physical configurations. So perspective is taken as fundamental in a way. And here you have perspective plus the actual limit. And how do you differentiate between the perspectival limit and the ontological limit? Is there any means of doing so logically? How do you get to this idea of the very last things in reality in terms of like the extension of space? Let's just think of it in terms of space extended infinitely and containing infinitely many bodies. So in the relativistic conception, you couldn't draw an infinite grid with things configured in a particular way and say that this infinite extension of things in this configuration, that infinite extension is reality, because that would be positing reality as fundamentally partible. And like in parts, absolutely. Instead, for any perspective, you have a configuration space of differentiated things, and then there's a range beyond which no meaningful information can enter into that perspective. In which case, then you would have reality as a set of monads. And these monads would be as numerous as the possible information space of the absolute largest perspective. So I think perspectives do arise through a kind of law. In order for something to function as a perspective, I agree with IIT, it has to be an integrated information system. So let's get into that. Any random set of objects, A, B, C, D, E here, won't necessarily constitute an integrated information system. It will if every part communicates with every other part and you're not missing some part which gives relevance to an existing aspect. And so, for example, like the arm of a chair, you have a recliner chair here. It's another arm, back, nice and cozy, some legs. So this arm in isolation plus this part of the back of the chair, like this set of entities here, this random set of entities, does not constitute an integrated information system. The whole chair probably won't constitute an integrated information system because in order for this form to appear as it's appearing to us, there needs to be some kind of means whereby all of the differentiated points are brought together so that all points can communicate with all other points. For the chair, that could be our brain. That could be us as an observer. And for, or any other kind of observer. Individual molecular configurations within the armchair may themselves be integrated information systems, but those very small systems, information systems, would have a small boundary of relevance, threshold of relevance, where there's like the shape of the overall chair has no way of being communicated to this integrated system if it is an integrated system. It's absolutely irrelevant and therefore outside the domain of that horizon of meaning for the perspective of that molecular configuration. So that defines what a valid perspective is. A valid perspective is an integrated information system. It explains why it's a unity. The problem of consciousness, the hard problem, is essentially we have these many things and they're brought together somehow. We see them as separate things, and yet together they are all brought into one conscious mind. What constitutes that oneness? That is the integration of the system, which viewed bottom up is an emergent property out of these lower level systems. But each of these lower level systems also in their own right is a part, a true part, has a real existence only if it itself has a wholeness to it that is real, has an integration to it that is real. So real things are monads, integrated information systems, observers, or they are objects like an armchair, which are intelligible as parts of observation, but aren't themselves integrated information systems. Okay, so looking at this again, there is a finite perspective that is well defined. We have the unity represented by the dot at the center, which brings all of that which is well defined into a finite perspective. Beyond that, you have a range of possible values for energy packets that have been observed. So here, let's say there's a range of configuration. The integration of the system is the same at each of these points. The observer here is the same and allows this kind of unity across time, but the configuration space changes. And maybe this particle here in this first configuration space does not immediately interact with any of the other particles, nor does it interact with the observer, and so it's lost from sight. However, the internal configuration of, say, the neurology of the perceiver here, if it's a human, or the configuration of probability spaces for the various particles of some complex molecular configuration, that memory that is internalized in the configuration of the observer, even if there's no in the present, location for the energy packet which was observed locally here. The continuity of energy, the conservation of energy, Kant explains as basically that which allows for the progression of time. Right? So a timeline is a sequence of configuration states of a system where the PSR, principle of sufficient reason, is observed essentially, and everything that you observe proceeds to some other thing. If the PSR, the conservation of energy, didn't hold between states, then that timeline would be constituted by nothing in particular, and you might as well just perceive randomness, but then that randomness doesn't cohere together into an intelligible sequence. The intelligibility of the sequence between these perspectives is brought about because of the PSR, and that can be accounted for anthropically, right? If the perspective is the internalized implicate order of the whole, which we're symbolizing with the chevron, that perspective has an infinite array of configuration space to perceive. It can perceive all of it simultaneously, and also those configuration spaces where the envelope of the perspective is compatible enough so that a meaningful timeline can be drawn. So the time can emerge via the anthropic principle, in that given any configuration space, there's given a superabundance of other configuration spaces, and given the identity of the perceiver, past states will be available, future states will be available, where the PSR holds, conservation of energy holds, and a timeline is a meaningful entity. This is like in the Platonic system, where you have the one at the top, and then you have intellect. Think of that as like the set of forms. The forms in reality are intellect. I'm going to strive for a pentagon. Could have been worse. Okay, so you have intellect here. These all exist simultaneously. Each form contains all the others implicitly, but each one is a particular emphasis of the formal configuration space. So that's like the set of all configuration spaces. And then beneath that is the level of soul. So you have this movement. That's wind here. The pneuma is moving between these forms. Everything it encounters has its subsistence descending from that realm of forms, each particular thing. But the movement is this timeline, which is a real identifiable object. And the nature of even that timeline is itself implicate in the formal structure, implicate in that universally distributed logos. Right? So that's the existence of the time. It is a real existence as a whole, because it's integrated as a whole, because there's more information from the timeline than from these non-connected but adjacent configuration spaces of like pure information and observers outside of a timeline. Right? That's where the soul comes into it, where time comes into it in Platonism. And so that's how the timeline emerges. Well, here you have a configuration space where things are well defined. You have a space, you have all the energy, and this contains also in this well-defined space, it's past and future within the range where it's identifiable, and that also will be probabilistic. And so at the beginning of the past, things are well specified. It's like the light cone of a particle, right? As you move out in time, it's narrow, and then as you move further out, it becomes really, really wide. So like the probability distribution of states in the distant past is wide, the distant future is wide, but close to the present, because the presence of other objects in your environment has impacted the configuration of your perceptual system, that narrows down the kinds of timeline you could be connected to. And so that means you have a well-defined space of perspective, and then you have a less well-defined space. Why did I draw an F? Space. Less well-defined space. And then you have indifference, where whatever's beyond this point out here, it makes no difference to the observer, even hypothetically. Okay. So that will mean that every observer exists ontologically in a superposition of possible contexts. So here's the identity. Within this, there is a range where there's probability distributions for energy packets at various scales inside the perspective space. And so there's a range of possibilities contained, range of timelines contained in this probability space. And then beyond that, there's a superabundance allowing for an infinite continuity of perspective through time. So you can draw timelines going on indefinitely. And that principle is what would account for reincarnation as I understand it. And not just reincarnation, but also other more exotic possibilities. I would argue, though, that there is a kind of simple mechanism built in for some kind of reincarnation without invoking any kind of exotic space of where the soul goes after death, right? Because if you're an observer here, in the superposition space of possible substrates, the possible substrates down here could be future brain in vat computers, could be other supercomputers running a bunch of different consciousnesses, could be some kind of advanced system in some much larger cosmos where the configuration of high energy membranes maps perfectly all the information contained in the observer up here, and all of these different possible substrates for the observer. And this also includes different cosmological configurations that are outside the scope of relevance for the observer. All of these are real possibilities, and when the observer, as a human being, dies, the possibility would be there that they are basically, say that they were essentially an avatar in a video game. They could be withdrawn, and then their next existence could be in whatever kind of overworld was running the simulation on this computer. So out comes the little guy from the computer, and he's so excited to be out in the real world. So it could be something like that, right? You could have that kind of afterlife. There could even be colleges of beings in this higher plane that organize pathways of initiation by sending the soul, which they're controlling through this set of different computing substrates or whatever technology they might have for running consciousness. So they could set up different kinds of ordeals and different levels, different planes. They could give you a trial period. They could engineer the reincarnation process so that it resembles myths of the afterlife from any various culture. Or a simpler kind of naturalistic, unengineered solution for the problem of reincarnation would be that while you're aware, you go from basically no awareness, no perspective, right when your integrated system comes into being. It comes into being with a very, very low level of informational discernment, right? It's like light and shadow. It's like comfort, discomfort. It's like the very most primitive sorts of informational distinctions that can be made. They exist here. And then the rest of life is pretty much of a relatively consistent size of information space. And then at the end of life as well, if consciousness degrades right up until the point of death, then there is a diminution of the complexity of the information that the observer can distinguish. Right here in the prime of life, we can make fine distinctions about interpretations of Melville, or we can engage in advanced mathematics and deal with computations that involve many uh, millions of different configuration possibilities, and there's a high degree of informational specificity. But here, your dementia, Alzheimer's, on your deathbed, everything's fallen apart. You're not able to think clearly, and right as you go out, you go back through at the very end this state where there's very, very primitive informational distinctions that the observer can actually track. And because of that, there is an overlap between the kinds of experiences you might have right before death and the kinds you might have right before conception, or right before coming into being as an integrated system, or just as you're coming into being. So that would be an explanation for reincarnation. Then there's there's natural reincarnation, unorganized, and just governed kind of by statistical chance, in a sense, where the probability distribution of what underlies the observer is distributed because the complexity of these various possibilities is not necessarily going to give it an equal number. So say there's an infinite number of brains in vats that run a given consciousness, but that infinite number is smaller than the number of supercomputers that runs whatever the ratio is of these various possible substrates for consciousness. They're not distributed evenly because some are more complex systems that take more effort to build. There can be fewer of them in any given substrate system. Hopefully you can understand the kind of dynamics governing the distribution of probability for this space that I'm referencing here. But following this kind of statistical natural process, I think reincarnation, like something like this, is what you would see. And then there's a space of let's just call it like demiurge space, where there's some kind of science for governing, like immortal science of governing how that proceeds. And hypothetically, demons could get involved here and make deals and capture souls in different computing substrates and send them through different ordeals and have them perform work and enslave these souls and get them involved in inter-lifetime processes. And there's a space for higher intelligences, higher beings that are not necessarily out for your good, right? There's a parasitic space of parasitic engineering is probably the way to put it. Parasitic engineering, and then lastly, altruistic engineering, where in that information space, the infinite, unbounded, omni-distributed law of the universe, there will be the perspectives which are most total, who see the nature of all, or just about all. And these more total perspectives would have more power than any of these parasitical intelligences, for the reason that to be parasitical, you require the energy that these other beings could provide you. But if you're the most, say, here's the one up here, and here's the very simplest kind of perspectives, these perspectives would already have whatever power the parasitical engineers would want from you. And so instead, they could engineer altruistically by arranging for an incarnation of that pure spirit of the divine, and that you could have a relationship, a personal relationship with that being through parapsychology, through psi. So you can have a telepathic relationship with an actual concrete being who himself is carrying the energy of that higher level perspective tied to the one. And so the divine energy can go all the way down to a human incarnation. And then you, by way of a telepathic relationship with that, can be guided in the course of your reincarnation upward, back to the one. So that is basically the shortcut. That's the Christian shortcut. But how does that work? You might wonder. Like, how does the telepathic relationship work? How can a human carry a divine energy? Well, in the sense that you can be right or wrong about metaphysics. That's what this whole talk is predicated based on. And I think if you want to deny the possibility of metaphysics, you're going to run into all sorts of internal contradictions, and your worldview is going to ultimately fall apart, and it's not going to win compared to a worldview that posits the possibility of metaphysics. And even if we can't be certain either way, and we shouldn't assume we can't be certain yet, but even if we can't be certain, having a good hypothesis, a hypothesis that explains some things that we do observe, is better than no hypothesis metaphysically and just a shrug. So anyway, assuming metaphysics is possible, there is correct metaphysical belief and incorrect metaphysical belief. And metaphysical belief in turn will lead to ethical precepts, like the nature of the good and the bad will be built into the nature of reality in general, because here you have reality, here you have good and bad. These are different configuration spaces, different dichotomies that can be established with respect to a perspective. And the nature of these is clarified metaphysically, because these are essential questions. Metaphysics has to do with the essences of things, and whereas physics has to do with the dynamics of things. Physics never tells you about essences. It only tells you about the role that things have dynamically relative to each other. So ethics is a metaphysical question. If you're right about metaphysics, you can be right, therefore, about ethics, and therefore you can act in the world either according to the divine energy, which is truth, right? This whole reality, positing it is one way, distributed law, that truth can be known, the ethical truth can be known, internalized by a human, and then acted out perfectly by a human. And it's like, imagine an infinite number of worlds where you could act in an infinite number of different ways. There would be a couple worlds where everything in your life just worked out for you. It's, it seems entirely improbable, but things where I just saw a video, a meme, a snowboarder was doing some kind of trick, and he put his hand out to correct himself mid jump, and he just landed perfectly, and it looked like no one could have planned that. It would be impossible. And there are other sorts of, just serendipitous, fortuitous circumstances that come up and everything just works out. That would be basically what an avatar would be like and how things would work out for them, because they're connected to that divine energy. Everything they do is in accord with the nature of reality as a whole. So that sort of being is a possibility, and whether or not you interact with them has to do not with material happenstance, not with the past, not with what's happened elsewhere, but it has to do with you. Because this thing, the divine man, perfect man, Jesus, Krishna, whatever you want to think of him as, this divine man, the perfect being, perfect human being, always acting in accordance with the divine energy, teaching, rectifying sin, guiding souls back to the divine nature, that is always there offering its energies telepathically to you, because there's no physical limitation on telekinetic abilities. There's no barrier of scale in space or in time, because okay, so I'm going to switch, and this is all explaining what I was just leading up to. I'm going to switch the way that I'm talking about this to Hilbert space and a wave model for thought. So why telepathy? Just to remember, that's what we're illustrating here. Why is there no physical constraint in the distance that telepathic processes could unfold? The reason is Hilbert space, this infinite dimensional vector and scalar space of functions mathematically, that contains all quantum states for different particles and entangled systems. And these entangled systems are integrated information systems. Individual particles, if they have a quantum state, we could say that insofar as they are one particle, they are also integrated information systems. So each monad in its totality has a corresponding wave function. Actually, I want to draw it like this. So there's a wave, a wave, a wave, a wave. There's all of these different wave functions for all of these different integrated information systems. In their pure form, all of them are stacked on top of each other so that we have this structure underlying all of reality, which is and I've used this term before, superposition of all functions of the undifferentiated. Oh God. That's close enough. Okay. So you have a superposition of all wave functions, and at baseline, what underlies all of this is this simplicity which characterizes reality. The one kind of perfect silence, standing wave, universal wave function. It doesn't move, it doesn't have any particular qualities, but it can be disturbed and put into any of these different states with different phases, different frequencies of vibration. Every conscious mind, the existence of this space is internal to the perspective, right? So the perspective you could think of as a boundary condition between that indeterminate you can barely read that, but whatever, indeterminate and indeterminate. In here, that there is a wave of possibility of the state of your own will, right? There's a wave of how you are moving internally, and there's a wave of how things outside of you are moving. When these two waves interact, that defines all of the positions of the particles with your interaction with the environment, right? Sense observation, perception, that is the interference pattern between two waves of possibility. The possible locations of all the various energy packets entailed by your timeline, and the possible configuration of inner space, where it could be that you modulate from one state of will, which is this chaotic wave pattern that looks like this, to one that's a little bit smoother, to one that's a little bit smoother, Or you could go from one that's like this to one that's like this, and then one that's like this, and you just start freaking out. And at every moment, there are different directions where that wave function could go. I think this is a good illustration of it. To an extent, I have to rely on anecdote to make this analogy, but I would say that music feels a certain way to us. Sounds, wave patterns, and colors feel a certain way to us because there is an analogy between the inner structure of will, this wave function of possible continuous states, and the waves of music, waves of electromagnetic spectrum, color, and the way they combine. And so, yeah, I would say that the nature of the wave pattern characterizing thought, the quantum state is a uh, wave function. The quantum state in your mind characterizing, so this integrated information system, just consider that a network of entangled particles. They all share a quantum state. That's the multiplicity. The unity is the quantum state, which is a wave. And the nature of that wave encodes a bunch of different underlying waves itself stemming from different things. It's like, imagine it's a pond and you drop a rock in, and you have ripples, but then someone else drops a rock in, and then you have ripples going this way, interference patterns creating ripples going that way. And so it could be decomposed into all the causes of these disturbances in the medium of consciousness. And so that outlines a range of possible pasts itself. That's one of the ways you can get this kind of range of possibilities, because the perspective isn't just like a pure point where things just pass into it, right? The perspective is a distributed point. It's an entangled point. It's a point, it's a wave function. It's one thing. It's one point in Hilbert space, but it is distributed in our space. And that opens up a range of possible means whereby you could get perturbation of the medium. So anyway, I'm going to erase a portion of this. So the upshot is all of these wave functions, everyone's, can be combined perfectly, and as a whole, they add up to this perfect simplicity, and also can be thought of as originating from this perfect simplicity. But all of these wave patterns are potentially in contact. They're in the same medium. They're disturbances of the same underlying medium. Our spatial relations and our causal relations are derived from the wave pattern, from the interaction of the outside wave pattern and the inside wave. That creates the interference pattern of perception. These wave patterns are all contained underlying space-time in that the shared space of Hilbert space. And through that medium, you could align yourself, you could resonate with, through will, any of these other thought forms, any of these other minds. And one of those minds is the perfect man. And by calling out willfully to that, you establish a connection, just like you could do with people who exist now. And if you haven't experimented with any of that, go ahead and give it a try. I know not everyone has an aptitude for it, but I know there's something to this stuff. So let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you next time.